Eleanor Vance stood on the glass-paneled mezzanine of Vanguard Holdings, looking down at the marble lobby, like a queen surveying a kingdom she was quietly growing to despise. At 48, Eleanor had built an empire. She wore custom Italian wool, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe, flawless twist, and her posture was as unyielding as the steel beams holding up the skyscraper. But behind the cold, gray eyes of the city's most ruthless female CEO was an exhaustion so deep it felt terminal. Since her husband died 5 years ago, she had surrounded herself with wealth polish and people who measured their worth in offshore accounts and tailored suits. She was tired of the noise, tired of the empty ambition. Today was the final executive tryout, a grueling high-stakes gauntlet designed to find the next vice president of operations. The men gathering in the lobby below were exactly what she expected. Sharks in gray flannel. They smelled of expensive cologne, old money, and ruthless entitlement. They laughed too loudly, checked their platinum watches, and exchanged predatory glances. But then Eleanor's eyes caught an irregularity, a disruption in her perfect sterile world. Sitting in the furthest corner of the vast waiting area, away from the leather couches and espresso machines, was a man who did not belong. He was a black man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered and imposing, yet he sat with a quiet, deliberate stillness that made him almost invisible to the arrogant men pacing the floor. His suit was clean, but undeniably tired. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs, the elbows rubbed slightly shiny from years of wear. It wasn't the suit of a corporate raider. It was the suit of a man who only wore it to funerals, court dates, and desperate job interviews. Eleanor's hand tightened on the glass railing. She watched him. There was a grounded, heavy dignity about him that the other men lacked. He wasn't looking around nervously. He wasn't trying to network. His massive, calloused hand rested protectively over a small, brightly colored object on his lap, a faded pink backpack with a cartoon unicorn on it. And leaning heavily against his side, fast asleep, was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her dark curls were slightly messy, her cheek pressed against the rough fabric of her father's jacket. She wore a hand-me-down coat that was a size too big, but her tiny hands were tucked warmly inside the father's oversized palm. Eleanor felt a strange, sudden tightness in her throat. She hadn't seen a child in this building in a decade. Vanguard Holdings was a place for predators, not for little girls in pink sneakers. The man Marcus Hayes, though Eleanor didn't know his name yet, adjusted his posture, absorbing the child's weight so she could sleep more comfortably. He barely breathed, as if his entire existence in that moment was dedicated solely to not waking her. It was an act of profound, quiet masculinity, protective, unshakable. Down in the lobby, the other candidates began to notice him. Preston Sterling, a 30-something executive with a trust fund and a sneer permanently etched onto his face, stopped pacing and stared at the corner. Preston nudged the man next to him, a wealthy board member's nephew named Caldwell. "Is the maintenance staff running late today?" Preston's voice was designed to carry. It bounced off the marble walls, sharp and cruel. "I didn't realize Vanguard was interviewing janitors for the VP slot. Or maybe he's just here to fix the plumbing." A low chorus of chuckles rippled through the group of millionaires. Marcus heard them. Eleanor, watching from 20 feet above, saw the slight hardening of his jaw. She saw the way his dark eyes briefly flicked toward the group of laughing men. The raw intelligence and suppressed power in that single glance was startling. If Marcus had wanted to, he could have physically broken Preston in half. But he didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend his honor. Instead, Marcus simply lifted his free hand and gently cupped it over his daughter's exposed ear, shielding her from the ugly sound of their laughter. He swallowed his pride to protect her peace. Eleanor froze. Her breath hitched. In all her years in corporate America, she had seen men destroy entire companies over a bruised ego. She had seen billionaires throw tantrums over a misplaced comma in a contract. Yet here was a man, dressed in a cheap suit, carrying the weight of the world, swallowing a public humiliation with the grace of a king, just to keep his little girl dreaming. "Who is that?" Eleanor whispered to herself, her voice trembling slightly. Below, Preston grew emboldened by Marcus's silence. He walked closer, a mocking smile on his face, holding his pristine leather briefcase. "Hey, buddy," Preston called out, his tone dripping with condescension. "The charity office is 3 blocks down. I think you took a wrong turn. And bringing a kid, really trying to milk the sympathy card before they toss your resume in the shredder." Marcus slowly raised his head. He didn't let go of his daughter. He looked dead into Preston's eyes, and the sheer, quiet intensity of his gaze made the younger man take a half-step back. "I am here for the tryout," Marcus said. His voice was deep resonant and completely devoid of fear. "And she is here because I don't leave my family behind. Not for you. Not for anyone." The heavy double oak doors of the Vanguard Holdings boardroom swung open, and an overly polished assistant stepped out, clutching a glowing tablet. "Gentlemen, the board is ready for the preliminary review. Please proceed inside." The candidates surged forward, a wave of gray and navy wool, eager to claim the best seats. Preston Sterling shoulder-checked another executive, securing his place near the head of the massive mahogany table. In the corner, Marcus Hayes didn't rush. He gently stroked his daughter's shoulder. Maya blinked, rubbing her eyes with a small, sleepy fist. "Hey, little bird," Marcus whispered, his voice dropping to a low, comforting rumble. "Time to wake up. Daddy has to go to work now." "Are we at the big castle, Daddy?" Maya asked, her voice thick with sleep, looking around at the soaring marble pillars. "Something like that." Marcus smiled, a brief, genuine flash of warmth that entirely transformed his worn face. He stood up, hoisting her faded pink backpack onto his broad shoulder, and took her small hand. "Remember our deal? You sit quiet like a secret agent. And after this, we get the extra fudge ice cream." "Secret agent," Maya whispered, nodding seriously. She placed a finger over her lips. As Marcus entered the boardroom, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The board members, 7 men and women who possessed more wealth than several small nations combined, sat along one side of the table. At the center sat Richard Thorne, the vice chairman, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. But it was the woman sitting at the absolute head of the table who commanded the air in the room. Eleanor Vance. Eleanor watched as Marcus walked in. The squeak of his worn rubber soles against the polished hardwood floor was deafening in the pin-drop silence of the room. He didn't slink in. He walked with his spine perfectly straight, guiding his daughter to a small leather chair in the corner of the room. He took off his frayed suit jacket, carefully folding it and placing it on the floor so Maya could use it as a footrest. "Mr. Hayes, I presume?" Richard Thorne's voice cut through the room like a serrated knife. He peered over his reading glasses, his expression one of theatrical disbelief. "I was informed we had an unconventional candidate today. I didn't realize Vanguard had opened a daycare facility." A few of the board members snickered. Preston Sterling, sitting smugly across from the board, leaned back and crossed his arms. Marcus turned around. Without his jacket, his white button-down shirt showed the faint signs of being ironed one too many times, the collar slightly worn. But his forearms, visible where the sleeves were rolled up, were thick with muscle and corded veins. He looked like a titan who had been forced into mortal clothes. "My childcare fell through this morning, Mr. Thorne." Marcus said, his voice even and unapologetic. "My daughter Maya will not be a disruption. I am fully prepared for the evaluation." "Prepared?" Thorne scoffed, tossing a thin sheaf of papers onto the table. It was Marcus's resume. "I've reviewed your file, Mr. Hayes. You've spent the last 3 years working as a shift manager at an auto repair shop in Queens. Before that night, security at a warehouse. And you believe this qualifies you to manage a global logistics network for a Fortune 500 company. I manage 50 mechanics, oversee a supply chain of rare parts across 3 states, and turned a failing debt-ridden shop into the most profitable branch in the city within 18 months. Marcus replied calmly. Logistics is about moving resources efficiently when everything goes wrong. I specialize in things going wrong. Preston laughed aloud. Fixing a Honda Civic is a little different than routing multi-million-dollar freighters through the Suez Canal, buddy. This is the big leagues. We don't deal with grease monkeys. The disrespect was blatant, unvarnished. Eleanor, sitting in silence, felt her jaw tighten. She looked at Marcus's resume on her own tablet. Thorne had conveniently skipped over the earlier years of Marcus's life, the years before the auto shop. Eleanor's eyes scanned the data, her brow furrowing slightly. There was a massive gaping hole in his work history, a 5-year gap that ended abruptly 3 years ago. But before that gap, the credentials were staggering. MIT, advanced algorithms. Why was Thorne ignoring this? Mr. Sterling makes a fair if blunt point. A female board member chimed in, wrinkling her nose as she looked at Marcus's scuffed shoes. Vanguard represents a certain prestige. Our executives interact with prime ministers and foreign dignitaries. Presentation matters. Culture fit matters. Frankly, Mr. Hayes, you don't fit the culture. Culture. Marcus repeated the word, slowly tasting the bitterness of it. If your culture is based on the price of a man's tie, rather than the strength of his intellect, then perhaps it is your culture that needs fixing, ma'am. The room gasped collectively. It was corporate blasphemy. You do not talk back to the Vanguard board. Preston slammed his hand on the table. Who do you think you're talking to? You have a lot of nerve walking in here dragging your kid into a corporate boardroom and lecturing us. You're a joke, Hayes, a desperate guy looking for a handout. In the corner of the room, Maya stopped coloring. The little girl looked up, her large, dark eyes darting between the angry men in the expensive suits and her father. She clutched her pink unicorn backpack tightly to her chest. Marcus saw her flinch. His hands balled into fists at his sides, the knuckles turning lighter under his dark skin. The primal urge to protect his child, to tear the room apart, warred with the devastating reality that he needed this job to pay their impending rent. Eleanor leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers interlocking. She was about to speak, about to shut Thorne and Preston down. She wanted to see what Marcus would do. She needed to know if this man would break. The tension in the boardroom was thick enough to choke on, but Marcus Hayes did not break. He took a slow, measured breath, his eyes momentarily flicking to his daughter. Maya was coloring quietly, but her small shoulders were tense. She could feel the hostility in the room, even if she didn't understand the words. No, let's proceed with the simulation, Richard Thorne announced, smoothly, eager to move past the awkwardness and get back to the business of crushing the unqualified. He tapped his tablet, and the massive screen behind him hummed to life, displaying a complex, glowing map of the eastern seaboard. Gentlemen, a crisis scenario. Thorne began, his voice taking on a theatrical edge. A Category 4 hurricane has unexpectedly shifted course and is currently barreling toward the port of Miami. We have 3 Vanguard freighters carrying perishable, temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals worth over $400 million. They are 48 hours out. Mr. Sterling, how do you handle the logistics? Preston Sterling stood up, buttoning his custom-tailored jacket with a practiced flick of his wrist. He didn't even look at the map for long. Textbook crisis management, Richard, Preston said, smoothly, pacing with the confidence of a man who had been handed everything in life. We immediately reroute the freighters to Jacksonville. We eat the premium expedite fees to secure priority docking, deploy our corporate trucking fleet from the Atlanta hub, and write off an estimated 10% spoilage as an insurance claim. We protect the core asset, keep the shareholders calm, and pass the extra logistics costs down to the distributors. The board members nodded in unison. A few murmured their approval. It was a cold, efficient, and thoroughly ruthless corporate answer. Excellent. Clean and decisive. Thorne smiled, then his smile vanished as he turned his gaze to the corner of the room. Mr. Hayes, care to offer a different perspective? Or is managing a multi-million-dollar supply chain too far outside your expertise with spark plugs and tire rotations? Eleanor Vance remained perfectly still at the head of the table, her eyes fixed on Marcus. Marcus stood up. He didn't strut. He walked to the screen with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at. He stared at the glowing map for 3 seconds. Mr. Sterling's plan will result in the total loss of all $400 million worth of cargo, Marcus said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the absolute weight of undeniable fact. Preston scoffed loudly. "Excuse me." Marcus turned his dark eyes locking onto Preston. "Jacksonville's Port Authority has been running a massive structural overhaul on the I-95 freight corridor for the past 6 weeks. If you reroute 3 heavy-tonnage freighters there, you will hit an immediate logistical bottleneck at the rail depot. The corporate trucks you deploy from Atlanta will be gridlocked for 36 hours before they even reach the loading docks." Marcus pointed a thick, calloused finger at the map. "Those pharmaceuticals require continuous power to the refrigeration units. While your ships idle at a choked port waiting for clearance, the auxiliary fuel reserves for those units will run dry. The cargo spoils. All of it. You won't have an insurance claim. You'll have a catastrophic failure." The room went dead silent. Thorne blinked frantically, scrolling through his tablet to verify the Jacksonville construction data. The slight widening of his eyes confirmed Marcus was right. "So what is your grand solution, Hayes?" Preston snapped, his face flushing red. "You bypass Florida entirely," Marcus said smoothly. "You reroute to Savannah. You break the cargo down directly at the deepwater port. But you don't use Vanguard's corporate fleet. They are too rigid, heavily unionized and restricted by mandatory rest cycles that the storm delay won't accommodate. You contract a decentralized network of independent owner-operator long-haul truckers. They run leaner. They navigate alternative routes without waiting for corporate dispatch approval, and they can move the cargo inland before the storm surge hits the coast. You save the entire shipment, and you cut the expedite fees by 40%. It was brilliant. It was a masterpiece of real-world logistics, combining macro-level strategy with micro-level street knowledge. Eleanor felt a jolt of pure electricity run down her spine. The man wasn't just smart, he was a strategic genius. But the board was not looking at a genius. They were looking at a man in a frayed suit. Thorne recovered from his shock, his face hardening into a sneer. "Independent truckers, owner-operators. What is this? A blue-collar fantasy Vanguard does not rely on gig workers and rogue drivers for $500 million shipments. This is a Fortune 500 company. Mr. Hayes, not a local moving service. He's just trying to throw some overtime to his mechanic buddies." Preston laughed, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. You really don't understand how business works at this level, do you? You're applying a poverty mindset to a global crisis. The word asterisk, poverty asterisk, hung in the air, toxic and heavy. You think like a desperate man, Hayes?" Preston continued, stepping closer, leaning into the cruelty. "And Vanguard doesn't hire desperate men. We don't hire men who have to drag their kids to an executive tryout because they can't afford a babysitter. You're wasting our time. You don't belong in this room. And deep down, looking at you. You know it." In the corner, the sound of a crayon snapping in half echoed sharply. Maya had stopped coloring. The snap of the crayon echoed like a gunshot in the tense, polished acoustics of the Vanguard boardroom. Every head turned. Maya had slid down from the oversized leather chair. The faded pink unicorn backpack slipped from her shoulders and hit the floor with a soft thud. She didn't pick it up. Instead, the 6-year-old girl walked straight toward the massive mahogany table, her small, worn sneakers silent on the hardwood. Marcus immediately stepped forward, his protective instincts overriding everything else. "Maya, sweetie, no. Go back to your seat." But she didn't stop. She walked right up to where Preston Sterling was standing, his face still twisted in a sneer of arrogant triumph. Maya looked up at him. She didn't look scared. She looked profoundly, heartbreakingly serious. Preston looked down at her, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. What does she want? Look, Hayes, get your kid under control before security. Maya didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just looked at the wealthy men who had been tearing her father apart for the last 20 minutes, and in a clear, steady voice, she spoke 5 words that would alter the trajectory of everyone in that room. He sold everything for Mommy. The boardroom froze. The mocking smiles vanished. Marcus let out a ragged breath, closing his eyes as a look of profound, devastating pain washed over his face. He reached out gently, pulling Maya against his leg, shielding her from the stares of the room. He rested his large hand on her head, his fingers trembling just slightly. Maya, he whispered, his voice cracking. We don't talk about that. But they were being mean to you, she murmured, burying her face into his worn trousers. They said you were poor. You're not poor. You just gave all the money to the doctors. At the head of the table, Eleanor Vance stopped breathing. The words hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Asterisk. He sold everything for Mommy. Eleanor's hands moved on instinct. She snatched up her tablet, her manicured fingers flying across the glass screen. She bypassed the sanitized, heavily edited Vanguard HR file that Richard Thorne had provided. She typed directly into the Global Executive Database * Marcus Hayes. MIT, Advanced Algorithms. Wife. The search results populated in a fraction of a second. Eleanor stared at the screen, the color completely drained from her face. There it was. A headline from a prominent tech journal dated exactly 5 years ago. * Marcus Hayes, lead architect and founder of Apex Dynamics, liquidates $80. Million stake to fund experimental cancer treatment for wife. Eleanor scrolled rapidly, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. The articles painted a tragic, terrifying picture of a man who had reached the absolute pinnacle of the tech and logistics world, only to have his life obliterated by a diagnosis. When insurance companies refused to cover the highly experimental out-of-network immunotherapy his wife needed, Marcus hadn't hesitated. He sold his shares. He sold their estate. He liquidated every asset he had ever built to buy her more time. The treatment had drained his fortune in less than 2 years, and it had failed. His wife had passed away 3 years ago, the exact moment the gap in his resume began. Bankrupt, grieving, and left entirely alone with a toddler, the former tech titan had taken whatever jobs he could get that allowed him the flexibility to be a single father. He took night shifts as a security guard. He worked as a mechanic. He traded boardrooms for grease and concrete, not out of incompetence, but out of a desperate, unconditional love for his child. He didn't have a poverty mindset. He had a survivor's soul. Eleanor looked up from the tablet. Her eyes, usually cold and detached, were suddenly bright with unshed tears. She looked at Marcus's frayed suit cuffs. She looked at his scuffed shoes. They weren't symbols of failure. They were the battle scars of a man who had sacrificed an empire for his family. Preston Sterling, however, had not connected the dots. He lacked the basic human empathy required to read the room. Sold everything. Preston scoffed, breaking the silence with a jarring, ugly laugh. He adjusted his silk tie. What did he sell, kid? A used Chevy. Look, this is a touching sob story. Really, it belongs on a daytime talk show. But we are running a global corporation here. We don't hand out executive vice presidencies out of pity. Preston. The voice did not come from Marcus. It came from the head of the table. It was Eleanor. She stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. The exhaustion that had plagued her for years was gone, replaced by a searing, white-hot fury. The temperature in the room plummeted. Richard Thorne flinched. The other board members suddenly found their polished shoes incredibly interesting. "Excuse me, Eleanor," Preston said, his arrogant smile faltering slightly as he saw the look in the CEO's eyes. Eleanor didn't look at Preston. She picked up her tablet, walked around the massive mahogany table, and stopped directly in front of Marcus Hayes and his little girl. Eleanor Vance stopped directly in front of Marcus and his daughter. The board members watched in breathless silence. They expected their ruthless CEO to order security to escort the man out. Instead, Eleanor did something no one in the Vanguard building had ever seen her do. She, a woman who wore $1,000 custom suits and commanded a multi-billion-dollar empire, slowly sank to her knees on the hard floor, bringing herself down to the exact eye level of a 6-year-old girl. "Maya, is it?" Eleanor asked. Her voice, usually sharp enough to cut glass, was astonishingly gentle. Maya peeked out from behind her father's leg, her large eyes studying the woman. After a moment, she gave a tiny nod. "You are a very brave little girl," Eleanor said softly, offering a warm, genuine smile that cracked the icy facade she had worn for 5 years. "And you are absolutely right. Your daddy is not poor. Your daddy is one of the richest men I have ever had the honor of meeting." Marcus stared down at Eleanor, his guard still up, but the rigid defensive posture in his shoulders began to ease. He saw the sheen of tears in the CEO's eyes, an unexpected mirror to his own buried grief. Eleanor stood up. When she turned to face the room, the warmth vanished instantly. Her gray eyes swept across the mahogany table, lethal and uncompromising. The temperature in the room seemed to drop below freezing. She walked back to her seat, not to sit down, but to grab the master console cable. With a sharp click, she connected her tablet to the room's main projector. "Mr. Sterling," Eleanor's voice rang out cold and resonant. "You just accused this man of having a poverty mindset. You mocked his clothes. You mocked his resume. You stood there cloaked in your trust fund and unearned arrogance and told him he didn't understand how business works at this level." Preston swallowed hard, his smug smile completely wiped away. "Eleanor, I was merely pointing out that—" Silence. The single word cracked like a whip. Preston snapped his mouth shut. Eleanor hit a button on the console. The map of the eastern seaboard vanished from the massive screen behind her. In its place, projected in glowing 10-foot letters, was the Tech Journal article she had just found. Marcus Hayes, lead architect and founder of Apex Dynamics, liquidates $80. Million stake to fund experimental cancer treatment for wife. A collective synchronized gasp echoed through the boardroom. The color drained entirely from Preston Sterling's face. He looked at the screen, then at the man in the frayed suit standing quietly in the corner. "For those of you who are apparently too incompetent to read beyond the first page of a dossier," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with venom, "Apex Dynamics developed the core algorithmic routing software that Vanguard Holdings currently uses to manage 60% of our global freight." "Yes, Mr. Sterling. The very software you so confidently planned to use to reroute those ships to Jacksonville was written by the man you just called a grease monkey." Preston was practically hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room. I had no idea. The file didn't say." Eleanor turned her devastating gaze toward the vice chairman. "Richard, care to explain why the founder of a billion-dollar tech firm had his work history truncated in your official HR brief?" Richard Thorne was sweating through his expensive silk shirt. He stammered, pulling at his collar. "Eleanor, be reasonable. The man has been out of the industry for over 3 years. He's been working at a garage. I deemed that 5-year gap to be an unacceptable risk. In corporate terms, he is a liability. His past achievements are irrelevant to his current state of decay." "Decay," Eleanor repeated, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "A man sacrifices his empire, his fortune, and his professional standing to fight for the life of the woman he loves. He takes grueling blue-collar jobs just so he can be present every single day to raise his daughter alone. And you call that decay?" She walked slowly down the length of the table, her eyes locking onto every single board member who had snickered earlier. They shrank back in their chairs. "True leadership," Eleanor continued, her voice echoing off the marble walls, "is not about how well you can optimize a spreadsheet. It is not about how quickly you can sacrifice your drivers, your cargo, or your integrity to protect the bottom line. It is about what you are willing to sacrifice when everything is on the line. It is about grit. It is about humanity. It is about taking the hardest possible path because it is the right thing to do. She stopped near Preston, looking at him with utter disgust. You, Preston, would sell out this entire company for a quarterly bonus. You panic under pressure and apply textbook answers to real-world chaos. But Mr. Hayes knows what it means to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders and not break. He knows what real logistics are keeping a family running, keeping a daughter smiling when the universe has taken absolutely everything from you. In the corner, Marcus stood tall. He didn't gloat, he didn't smirk, but he pulled Maya just a little bit closer, his hand resting securely on her small shoulder. For the first time in 3 years, someone had looked past his frayed cuffs and seen the titan underneath. Eleanor, Preston squeaked, desperately trying to salvage his ruined career. I apologize. I clearly misjudged the situation. If Mr. Hayes wants to be part of the team, I'm sure we can find a place for him under my division. Oh, you misunderstand, Preston, Eleanor said, a cold, predatory smile finally touching her lips. He won't be working under you. Preston's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Eleanor, I don't understand. If he's not under my division, where does he fit? He doesn't fit under you, Preston, because you no longer work here, Eleanor stated. The words hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. Preston let out a nervous, high-pitched chuckle. Eleanor, be serious. I just closed the Miller account. My father and the chairman. Your father is a shareholder. He does not run the day-to-day operations of this company. I do. She interrupted, her voice a lethal calm. You have consistently demonstrated a profound lack of judgment, an inability to handle dynamic crises, and a toxic arrogance that is a cancer to this organization. You mocked a man in my boardroom based on the price of his shoes. You lack vision. You lack empathy. And as of this exact second, you lack a job. Eleanor pressed a button on the intercom, embedded in the table. Security, please come up to the main boardroom. Mr. Sterling needs assistance clearing out his desk. Ugh, you can't do this! Preston's voice cracked, panic finally overriding his pride. This is absurd. You're firing me over a maintenance worker. No, Eleanor corrected quietly. I am firing you over a fundamental flaw in your character. Goodbye, Preston. The heavy oak doors opened, and 2 imposing security guards stepped inside. The entire room watched in stunned silence as Preston Sterling, the golden boy of Vanguard Holdings, was escorted out, his face pale and his custom-tailored suit suddenly looking very cheap. When the doors clicked shut, Eleanor turned her attention back to the table. She looked at Richard Thorne, who was visibly trembling. Richard, she said softly. The vice chairman jumped slightly. You deliberately withheld critical information from this board to push your own prejudiced narrative. You are on notice. If I ever catch you sanitizing a file again to protect your fragile worldview, you will be following Mr. Sterling out the door. Is that understood? Crystal clear, Eleanor, Thorne rasped, refusing to meet her eyes. With the boardroom purged of its toxicity, Eleanor took a deep breath. The icy CEO persona melted away, leaving only a woman who had seen too much and was finally seeing clearly. She walked back over to the corner where Marcus was standing. He hadn't moved. His hand was still resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder. Eleanor stood before him, the disparity between their worlds still visible in the sharp lines of her Italian wool suit and the frayed edges of his collar. But the power dynamic had entirely shifted. Mr. Hayes, Eleanor began, her voice dropping to a sincere, quiet register that the board members couldn't hear. I want to personally apologize to you, not as the CEO of this company, but as a human being. What happened in this room today, what you and your daughter were subjected to, it was entirely unacceptable. You deserved far better. Marcus looked at her. He didn't immediately absolve her. He studied her face, looking for the lie, looking for the corporate spin. He found none. Only a deep, resonant respect and a shared understanding of grief. "It's not the first time people have judged the cover of the book, Miss Vance," Marcus said, his deep voice rumbling with quiet dignity. "It probably won't be the last. But my daughter shouldn't have had to defend me." "She shouldn't have," Eleanor agreed, her gaze dropping briefly to Maya. "But she raised the mirror this company desperately needed to look into." Eleanor looked back up, her expression turning professional, yet profoundly respectful. "Mr. Hayes, the position of Vice President of Operations is vacant, but frankly, considering your background, it's an insult to your capabilities. I want you as the Chief Strategy Officer for Vanguard Holdings, effective immediately." A murmur rippled through the few board members who overheard, but Eleanor ignored them. Marcus didn't flinch at the title or the implied millions it carried. He looked down at Maya. He thought of the garage, the smell of motor oil, the grueling night shifts that kept the lights on but stole his energy. He thought of the medical debt that was still hanging over his head. Then he looked back at Eleanor. "Miss Vance," Marcus said slowly, "if I take this job, there are conditions. My life is not a corporate asset anymore. I don't miss school plays. I don't work weekends unless the world is actually ending. And at 5:00 p.m. I leave, because my most important job is holding her hand on the walk home." Eleanor smiled. It was the first truly radiant smile she had worn since her husband died. "Marcus," she said softly, using his first name for the first time. "I wouldn't want you any other way. We have enough robots in this building. We need a father." Maya tugged on Marcus's pant leg. "Daddy," she whispered loudly, "did you get the job?" Marcus looked down at his daughter, the immense weight of the past 3 years finally beginning to lift from his broad shoulders. He picked her up, holding her securely against his chest, her pink backpack dangling from his arm. "Yeah, little bird," Marcus said, a genuine blinding smile breaking across his face. "Daddy got the job. Does this mean we get the extra fudge ice cream now?" Maya asked, looking at Eleanor to see if she was allowed to negotiate too. Eleanor laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed in the stifling boardroom. "It means," Eleanor said, gently tapping Maya's nose, "that you get all the extra fudge ice cream you want. In fact, if your dad doesn't mind, I know a place just down the block." The descent from the executive suite felt like returning to Earth from a hostile alien planet. As the glass elevator glided down to the lobby, Eleanor stood beside Marcus and Maya. The heavy, suffocating aura of Vanguard Holdings seemed to dissipate with every floor they passed. When the doors pinged open, the security guards who had looked right through Marcus an hour earlier immediately snapped to attention, offering deferential nods as the CEO walked past. Marcus noticed the shift, but he didn't gloat. He simply adjusted Maya's backpack on his shoulder and held her small hand as they walked out through the revolving glass doors and into the crisp afternoon air of the city. True to her word, Eleanor led them 2 blocks down to a small, brightly lit parlor called Sullivan's Sweet Shop Asterisk. It was a stark contrast to the Michelin-starred restaurants where Eleanor usually conducted business. The air smelled of waffle cones and spun sugar, and the floors were slightly sticky. When Maya enthusiastically pointed at the triple chocolate fudge, Eleanor instinctively reached for her purse, pulling out a sleek black titanium card. But a large, calloused hand gently intercepted hers. "I appreciate it, Eleanor," Marcus said softly, his voice a low rumble over the noise of the shop. "But I made a promise to my daughter this morning, and a father's promise has to be paid with his own sweat." He didn't say it with pride or arrogance, but with a quiet, immovable dignity. Eleanor looked at the frayed edge of his shirt cuff, then at his eyes. She slowly put the titanium card away and nodded. Marcus pulled out a worn leather wallet and paid with a few crumpled bills. He also ordered a plain black drip coffee in a paper cup and handed it to Eleanor. "They don't have the fancy espresso machines here," Marcus offered a half smile. "But it's hot. Right now, hot is exactly what I need," Eleanor replied. taking the cheap paper cup. The warmth seeped into her cold hands. They stepped outside and sat on a weathered green park bench facing the bustling street. Maya sat between them, her legs swinging happily over the edge as she tackled the mountain of chocolate ice cream, completely oblivious to the fact that her father had just become one of the most powerful executives in the city. For a long time, they just sat there. The CEO of a billion-dollar empire in her custom Italian wool, and the brilliant broken man in a tired suit. Eleanor took a sip of the bitter, burnt coffee. Surprisingly, it tasted better than the $15 imported lattes her assistant brought her every morning. It tasted real. I haven't sat on a park bench in I don't know how many years, Eleanor murmured, staring at the traffic. I usually view the city from the 42nd floor. It looks very different from up there, like a chessboard. It's easier to move people around when they just look like pieces, Marcus said quietly, wiping a stray smudge of chocolate from Maya's cheek with a napkin. Down here, you have to look them in the eye. It's messier, but it's honest. Eleanor turned to look at his profile. The harsh daylight caught the silver hairs at his temples and the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. Why didn't you fight back in there? Eleanor asked the question that had been haunting her finally slipping out. When Preston was insulting you, when Thorne was dismissing your entire life, you had the intellect to dismantle them both with a single sentence. Why did you just stand there and take it to Titoa? Marcus stopped wiping Maya's face. He rested his elbows on his knees, staring down at his scuffed shoes. When my wife Sarah got sick, Marcus began, his voice rough, I fought everything. I fought the doctors. I fought the insurance companies. I fought the absolute certainty of the universe. I spent every ounce of my genius, my anger, and my money trying to rewrite a tragedy. And in the end, I still lost her. He turned his head, his dark, soulful eyes meeting Eleanor's. The raw vulnerability in his gaze took her breath away. After you lose the center of your universe, Miss Vance, your ego burns away. You realize that pride is a luxury for people who haven't known real loss. I didn't care what those men thought of my suit or my resume. If letting them mock me meant I got a paycheck to keep a roof over my daughter's head, I would let them do it every day of the week. My pride died 3 years ago. All that's left is my purpose. He looked down at Maya, his expression softening entirely. And she is my purpose. Eleanor felt a hard, painful lump rise in her throat. She gripped the paper coffee cup tighter. My husband died 5 years ago, Eleanor whispered. It was a truth she rarely spoke aloud, tightly guarded behind her corporate armor. Heart attack. He was 50. I was so angry, so utterly hollowed out, that I decided to fill the void with Vanguard. I built a fortress of glass and steel so I wouldn't have to go home to an empty house. I surrounded myself with ruthless people because ruthless people don't ask you how your heart is doing. She looked down at her immaculate shoes, suddenly feeling very small. I traded my humanity for a crown, Marcus. And today, watching you protect your daughter, watching you hold on to your soul while mine has been starving for years, it broke me. It woke me up. Marcus looked at the powerful woman sitting beside him. He saw past the wealth, past the title, and saw the lonely, grieving widow hiding underneath. He didn't offer a corporate platitude. He didn't offer pity. Instead, he reached out and gently tapped his paper cup against hers. Then let's rebuild, Eleanor, Marcus said quietly. No more glass fortresses. Just a foundation that actually means something. On Monday morning, the atmosphere in the Vanguard Holdings lobby was entirely different. The news of Preston Sterling's brutal public firing and the sudden appointment of a mysterious new chief strategy officer had sent shockwaves through the glass fortress. The corporate sharks were on edge, whispering in hushed tones near the espresso machines. When the revolving doors spun, all eyes turned. Marcus Hayes walked in. He wasn't wearing the frayed, tired suit from the Tryout, nor had he attempted to mimic the absurd, flashy wealth of the men who had mocked him. He wore a sharply tailored navy blazer, crisp charcoal slacks, and a pristine white collar. He looked immaculate, powerful, and undeniably in command. Yet in a nod to the grounded reality he refused to abandon, he still wore comfortable dark rubber-soled shoes because he still walked Maya 6 blocks to her elementary school every morning. In his right hand, he carried a sleek leather briefcase provided by the company. In his left hand, swinging gently by his side, was a bright yellow plastic lunchbox covered in slightly peeling dinosaur stickers. A few junior executives stared bewildered, but no one dared say a word. The aura of absolute authority radiating from Marcus silenced the room before he even reached the elevators. Up on the 42nd floor, the executive boardroom was already buzzing. Richard Thorne was presenting a critical supply chain bottleneck regarding a manufacturing hub in Southeast Asia. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. When Marcus entered the room, fell dead silent. He took the seat to her immediate right, the seat of the second in command. He placed his briefcase on the floor and set the yellow dinosaur lunchbox right on the polished mahogany table, squarely next to his glowing tablet. Thorne cleared his throat nervously, trying to ignore the plastic lunchbox. As I was saying, Miss Vance, the Asian hub is lagging by 12%. The textbook solution is to implement strict punitive penalties for the factory supervisors and mandate mandatory overtime to close the gap. It will squeeze their margins, but it protects our delivery schedule. Eleanor didn't answer. She turned her head slightly, looking at Marcus. Mr. Hayes, your thoughts? Marcus didn't even look at the spreadsheet on the screen. He looked at Thorne. If you squeeze a starving man, Richard, you don't get more labor. You get a revolt, Marcus said, his deep voice calm but carrying the heavy weight of experience. I reviewed the data from that hub last night. The delay isn't a management failure, it's a structural exhaustion issue. The region just experienced a massive heat wave, and their cooling systems are outdated. You're asking people working in 100-degree heat to move faster. Thorne frowned. We aren't in the business of upgrading foreign infrastructure, Marcus. We are in the business of logistics. Logistics is the management of human stamina. Marcus countered smoothly, his brilliant analytical mind shifting into a gear the board had never witnessed. If you implement punitive overtime, the defect rate on the assembly line will spike by an estimated 8% due to fatigue. That will cost Vanguard $6 million in QA rejections. Instead, we authorize a micro-grant to upgrade their industrial HVAC systems and offer a 5% premium on the current contract for on-time delivery. We treat them like partners, not machinery. He tapped his tablet, projecting a new algorithm onto the screen. It was flawless. The cooling upgrade pays for itself in reduced defect rates within 3 weeks. The morale boost secures the delivery schedule. We spend less, we earn more, and we don't break the backs of the people doing the actual lifting. The board members stared at the data. It was a masterclass in strategic empathy, a concept completely foreign to the ruthless culture of Vanguard. Eleanor felt a thrill run through her blood. She watched Marcus command the room not through fear or intimidation, but through pure, undeniable genius and a deep, unshakable humanity. Implement Mr. Hayes's strategy immediately, Eleanor ordered, a genuine smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Thorne nodded quickly, scrambling to take notes. Hours later, the executive floor had quieted down. Eleanor walked down the plush, carpeted hallway and knocked lightly on the glass door of Marcus's new office. It was the corner suite formerly occupied by Preston Sterling, but Marcus had already stripped away the obnoxious abstract art and the miniature golf putting green. The office was clean, functional, and anchored by a framed photograph of Maya on the desk. Am I interrupting? Eleanor asked, leaning against the doorframe. Marcus looked up from a complex matrix of code he was writing, rubbing his tired eyes. The formidable executive melted away, leaving the gentle, hard-working man she had met on the park bench. Never. Come in. Eleanor walked over and sat in the chair opposite him. Her eyes drifted to the yellow dinosaur lunchbox sitting next to his keyboard. I have to admit, Eleanor said softly, watching you dismantle Richard Thorne's outdated worldview while a plastic triceratops stared at him, was the highlight of my professional career. Marcus chuckled a warm, resonant sound that made Eleanor's chest flutter in a way it hadn't in 5 years. He reached over and popped the latch on the lunchbox. Maya insisted. Marcus explained, his eyes softening as he looked inside. She said if I was going to be a secret agent at the big castle, I needed proper rations. He pulled out a sandwich wrapped in foil. When he unwrapped it, Eleanor saw that the bread had been painstakingly unevenly cut into the shape of a star. On top of the foil was a small, smudged sticky note written in purple crayon. Asterisk. I love you, Daddy. Don't let the mean men bite. Eleanor read the note, and a profound, aching tenderness washed over her. She looked at Marcus, who was staring at the unevenly cut sandwich as if it were a Michelin-starred meal. She's a very special little girl, Eleanor whispered. She saved my life, Marcus replied simply. He broke the star-shaped sandwich in half and held one piece out to Eleanor. Have you had lunch, Miss Vance? Eleanor looked at the piece of bread. For the CEO of Vanguard Holdings, breaking bread meant $50,000 charity dinners or hostile takeover negotiations at exclusive steakhouses. But sitting here in the quiet office taking half of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich from a man who had survived the absolute worst of the world with his soul intact, it felt like the most important meal of her life. She reached out her fingers briefly, warmly brushing against his. Thank you, Marcus, she said, taking a bite. And for the first time in a very long time, Eleanor Vance felt completely at home. For a month, Vanguard Holdings operated like a completely different company. The suffocating culture of fear and ruthless climbing was replaced by cold, hard efficiency, paired with genuine human consideration. Marcus's strategies saved the company millions, and Eleanor found herself smiling more in 30 days than she had in 5 long years. But the past, especially when bruised and humiliated, rarely stays quiet. It started on a rainy Tuesday morning. Eleanor walked into the executive suite expecting the usual quiet hum of productivity. Instead, the 42nd floor was in absolute chaos. Phones were ringing incessantly. PR executives were sprinting down the halls, their faces pale. Richard Thorne stood outside Eleanor's office, clutching a tablet. Then, Eleanor, have you seen the asterisk Wall Street Chronicle asterisk? Eleanor snatched the tablet from his hands. The headline made her blood run freezing cold. Vanguard's fatal flaw CEO Eleanor Vance appoints bankrupt ex-tech titan amidst whispers of romantic conflict of interest. Is Marcus Hayes a tragic hero or a reckless liability? Asterisk, asterisk. She skimmed the article. It was a vicious, highly calculated hit piece. It didn't mention Marcus's heroism or his brilliant logistical mind. Instead, it twisted the painful liquidation of Apex Dynamics. It quoted anonymous former investors who claimed Marcus had acted erratically, draining company assets recklessly and leaving his shareholders out to dry. Worse, it painted Eleanor as a vulnerable, grieving widow who had been manipulated by a desperate, smooth-talking con man looking for his next payday. At the bottom of the article was a chilling note asterisk. An emergency shareholder meeting has been called by the Sterling Family Trust. Preston. 10 minutes later, Eleanor burst into the main boardroom. The board members were already assembled, muttering anxiously. Marcus was standing by the window, his posture rigid, looking out at the driving rain. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly exhausted. The massive screen at the head of the table flared to life. Preston Sterling's face appeared via an encrypted video link, sitting beside his father, Arthur Sterling, who held a massive block of Vanguard stock. Preston looked exceptionally smug. "Good morning, Eleanor," Preston sneered, dropping the polite facade entirely. "I trust you've read the morning paper." "This is criminal defamation, Preston," Eleanor snarled, her hands planted firmly on the mahogany table, leaning forward like a predator. "It's a pathetic, desperate lie, orchestrated by a boy who couldn't handle being exposed for his own incompetence." Is it? Preston smiled coldly. The board needs stability, Eleanor. Our stock dropped 3% in pre-market trading. Investors don't like erratic leadership, and they certainly don't like finding out that the CEO is using the corporate payroll to play house with a bankrupt mechanic who tanked his last company. A murmur of discomfort rippled through the room. Thorne looked down at his shoes. "Arthur," Eleanor commanded, shifting her gaze to Preston's father, "you are a smart man. You know Marcus's strategies have increased our quarterly projections by 12%. You know this article is a smear campaign." "I know the optics are terrible, Eleanor," the elder Sterling replied, coldly, unbothered by the truth. "My son may have been tactless, but the market responds to perception. Mr. Hayes has a history of liquidating assets under emotional distress. Now the press is implying an inappropriate relationship between the two of you. The board is calling for a vote of no confidence in your leadership unless the liability is immediately removed." Eleanor's eyes blazed with a terrifying fury. "I will not fire a man who has done nothing but save this company. If you want to fire him, you'll have to fire me first. Let's see how the market reacts to Vanguard losing its CEO." "Eleanor, stop." The deep, quiet voice cut through the shouting. Marcus turned away from the window. The fight had drained out of his eyes, replaced by the same heavy protective stillness he had worn in the lobby on the day of the tryout. "Marcus, don't," Eleanor pleaded, her heart dropping into her stomach. He walked over to the table. He didn't look at Preston. He didn't look at the board. He only looked at Eleanor. "When I took this job," Marcus said softly. His voice meant only for her. "Despite the audience, I told you my priority was my daughter. I will not have Maya's name or my late wife's memory dragged through the tabloid mud by trust fund cowards looking for revenge. I won't let them turn Sarah's death into a cheap corporate scandal." "We can fight this," Eleanor whispered, stepping closer to him, entirely uncaring of the optics. "We can release the real data. We can sue them into oblivion. If we fight in the mud, we get dirty," Marcus said gently. He reached out his large, warm hand, briefly gripping her shoulder. "And you have a company to protect. You built this empire, Eleanor. I won't let my past tear it down." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his silver Vanguard security badge, and placed it quietly on the table. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, finally looking up at the screen. His dark eyes were lethal and utterly unbothered by the wealth on the other side of the camera. "You win the news cycle, but you will never understand what it means to be a man." Without another word, Marcus turned and walked out of the boardroom. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, leaving an echoing, suffocating silence in the room. Eleanor stared at the silver badge on the table. The man who had brought light back into her life was gone. And as she looked up at the smug face of Preston Sterling on the monitor, the warmth in her heart instantly froze over, replaced by a terrifying, absolute resolve. Preston thought he had won. He didn't realize he had just declared war on a queen who had nothing left to lose. The rain was coming down in sheets, washing the neon glow of the city streets into a blur of reds and yellows. Eleanor sat in the back of her chauffeured town car, the leather seat cold against her back. The silver Vanguard security badge Marcus had left on the boardroom table rested in the palm of her hand. Her phone had been vibrating continuously for 3 hours. Thorne, board members, PR managers. They all wanted a piece of her, demanding a statement, demanding she distance herself from the scandal. She turned the phone off and tossed it onto the empty seat beside her. She looked out the window. For 5 years, she had believed that power was the ultimate armor against grief. She had thought that if she just built the walls high enough, nothing could ever hurt her again. But sitting in the silence of the luxury car, she realized the terrifying truth: the walls hadn't protected her. They had entombed her. And Marcus Hayes had been the only person brave enough to reach in and pull her out. "Thomas," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the engine. "Yes, Miss Vance." "Are we still heading to the penthouse?" the driver asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. "No," Eleanor said, her grip tightening around the silver badge. Take me to Queens, 412 Elmwood Avenue. The drive felt like an eternity. When the car finally pulled up to the address, it was a modest, slightly weathered brick apartment building. A single flickering porch light cast a pale yellow glow over the front steps. It was a million miles away from the glass penthouses of Manhattan. "I can wait here, ma'am," Thomas offered, eyeing the neighborhood through the rain-streaked windshield. "That won't be necessary. Go home, Thomas. Take the night off," Eleanor said. She didn't grab an umbrella. She stepped out into the freezing rain, her custom Italian suit instantly soaking through her immaculate hair, plastering to her face. She didn't care. The cold felt real. It felt like waking up. She walked up the concrete steps and pressed the buzzer for apartment 2B. A minute passed. Then the heavy wooden door creaked open. Marcus stood in the doorway. He was wearing faded gray sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt, a dish towel thrown over his broad shoulder. When he saw Eleanor standing on his tiny porch, drenched and shivering, his eyes widened in absolute shock. "Oh, Eleanor, what are you doing here?" He instinctively stepped back, pulling the door wider. "Get inside, you're freezing." She stepped into the small apartment. It wasn't large, but it was impeccably clean and radiated warmth. The smell of baked ziti hung in the air. A small pile of Maya's school drawings was neatly stacked on the coffee table. It was a home. A real home. Marcus grabbed a dry blanket from the back of the sofa and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. "Are you out of your mind? You shouldn't be here. There are reporters." "I don't care about the reporters, Marcus." Eleanor interrupted, her voice trembling, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming flood of emotion she had been holding back all day. She reached into her wet coat pocket, pulled out his silver security badge, and placed it firmly on his small dining table. "I do not accept your resignation," she said, her gray eyes locking onto his. Marcus looked at the badge, his jaw tightening. "Eleanor, we talked about this. Preston Sterling is trying to burn you at the stake, and he's using my past as the matches. If I stay, you lose the company." "Let them have the damn company," Eleanor shouted, the sheer force of her voice surprising them both. She took a step closer to him, the blanket slipping slightly from her shoulders. "Do you think I care about the stock price? Do you think I care about Vanguard? I built that empire to survive Marcus. But I don't want to just survive anymore. I want to live." Marcus stared at her, the defensive walls he had built around his own heart, slowly beginning to crack. "You walked away today because you wanted to protect my legacy," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a raw, pleading whisper. "But my legacy is meaningless if it means going back to being the ghost I was before I met you. You brought a little girl with a pink backpack into my boardroom, and you reminded me what a soul looks like. You don't get to walk away from me now." Marcus let out a ragged breath. The titan who had carried the weight of the world for 3 years finally looked like a man who just wanted to put the burden down. "Eleanor," he whispered, stepping closer, his large hands gently gripping her arms. "I am a broken man. I have a mountain of medical debt. I have a little girl who needs me to be everything for her. I don't have an empire to offer you." Eleanor reached up her cold, trembling fingers, gently tracing the line of his jaw. "I don't need an empire, Marcus," she said, tears finally mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I just need you, and I need Maya. We'll fight Preston. We'll fight the board. We'll fight the whole damn city if we have to. But we do it together." From the hallway, a small voice broke the silence. "Daddy is the secret agent lady here." Eleanor and Marcus turned. Maya was standing in the doorway of her bedroom, wearing oversized dinosaur pajamas, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Marcus looked at his daughter, then back at the incredibly powerful, fiercely vulnerable woman standing in his living room. The last remnants of his pride and fear completely vanished. He pulled Eleanor against his chest. It was a desperate, crushing embrace filled with years of stored-up grief and an undeniable, overwhelming relief. Eleanor buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the scent of clean laundry and home, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist. "Okay, Marcus whispered into her wet hair, his voice thick with emotion. Together. The emergency shareholder meeting, held exactly 72 hours after the hit piece dropped, was a media circus. The lobby of Vanguard Holdings was swarming with financial journalists, camera flashes reflecting off the pristine glass walls. Up in the grand amphitheater on the 50th floor, the atmosphere was venomous. Arthur Sterling stood at the podium, his son Preston flanking him like a smug lieutenant. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board and esteemed shareholders," Arthur boomed, his voice echoing through the massive room. "We are here today to rectify a catastrophic lapse in judgment. The market demands stability. Therefore, the Sterling Trust formally moves for the immediate removal of Eleanor Vance as CEO and the termination of Marcus Hayes." A heavy murmur filled the room. Preston smirked, already picturing his name on the corner office door. Then the heavy double doors at the back of the amphitheater swung open. Eleanor Vance walked in. But she wasn't the exhausted, defensive widow the tabloids had painted her to be. She was radiant lethal and absolutely terrifying in a blood-red blazer. And walking right beside her, matching her stride perfectly, was Marcus Hayes. He wore a masterfully tailored charcoal suit, his broad shoulders squared, emanating the undeniable aura of a tech titan reclaiming his throne. The whispers in the room died instantly. "I apologize for the delay," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the silence like a diamond blade as she and Marcus took the center stage. "We were downstairs speaking with the Securities and Exchange Commission." Preston's smug smile faltered. Arthur frowned. "The SEC, Eleanor. What kind of theatrical stunt is this?" "You are entirely out of order." "No, Arthur. I am finally in order," Eleanor replied, her eyes locking onto the older man. She stepped aside, yielding the floor to Marcus. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply connected his tablet to the massive overhead projector. Over the past 3 days, while Mr. Sterling was busy feeding anonymous lies to the tabloids, I was busy doing my job as Chief Strategy Officer. Marcus began, his deep, resonant voice captivating the entire room. "My background is in advanced routing algorithms. As it turns out, data logistics are remarkably similar to freight logistics. If you know how to track a cargo ship, you know how to track a digital footprint." The screen behind them flared to life. It didn't show shipping routes. It showed a complex web of financial transfers, encrypted emails, and offshore holding accounts. "This," Marcus pointed to a massive red cluster on the screen, "is a coordinated short-selling scheme." 3 days before the hit piece was published, a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands heavily shorted Vanguard stock. When the article dropped, the stock dipped 3%, netting this shell company over $14 million. The shareholders gasped. Insider trading, the absolute cardinal sin of the financial world. "And who owns this shell company?" Marcus asked the silent room. He tapped the screen one final time. The red cluster unraveled, pointing directly to a name, *, the Arthur Sterling Family Trust. Arthur's face drained of all color. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. "This is fabricated. This is an outrage. It is a federal crime, Arthur." Eleanor interrupted, her voice booming with absolute authority. "We handed the unencrypted server logs to the SEC 20 minutes ago. They verified that Preston used his executive clearance to leak confidential Vanguard data to the press to artificially manipulate the stock price for your trust's benefit." Preston looked like he was about to faint. He stumbled backward, looking desperately at his father. "Dad, you said it was untraceable. You said the proxy servers." "Shut up, you idiot," Arthur hissed, realizing his own son had just confessed in front of 200 shareholders and a hot microphone. "The motion to remove me is denied," Eleanor stated, stepping up to the microphone, her presence completely dominating the room. "However, I am formally moving to strip the Sterling Trust of its voting rights pending federal indictment. Security, please escort these 2 men to the lobby. The federal agents are waiting for them." The applause that erupted in the amphitheater was deafening. It wasn't just a victory, it was a massacre. Eleanor watched as Preston and Arthur, the men who had mocked a father's frayed suit and exploited a widow's grief, were unceremoniously dragged out of the empire they had tried to steal. She turned and looked at Marcus. The noise of the room faded away. He looked back at her, that same warm, grounding smile touching his eyes. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. 6 months later. Asterisk, asterisk. The autumn sun shone brightly over Central Park, casting long golden shadows across the grass. Eleanor wore blue jeans and an oversized, comfortable sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her expensive heels had been permanently traded for a pair of white sneakers. She sat on a weathered park bench, a paper cup of cheap hot coffee in her hands. A few yards away, Marcus was pushing Maya on the swings. The little girl's laughter rang out clear and joyful, mingling with the sounds of the city. She was wearing a new coat, but she still insisted on carrying the faded pink unicorn backpack. Marcus caught the swing tickling Maya's sides until she shrieked with laughter, then hoisted her up onto his broad shoulders. He walked over to the bench, his eyes locking onto Eleanor with a love so deep and profound, it still took her breath away. "Daddy, can we get the extra fudge ice cream now?" Maya asked, resting her chin on top of Marcus's head. "I don't know, little bird," Marcus teased, looking at Eleanor. "We have to ask the boss." Eleanor smiled, standing up and wrapping her arms around Marcus's waist, pressing a gentle kiss to his cheek. "The boss says," Eleanor whispered, looking up at the two people who had saved her life, "that we can have whatever we want." Maya cheered immediately, squirming down from her father's shoulders to grab Eleanor's hand. Eleanor held the little girl's small hand in hers. She looked back at the skyline in the distance, where the glass spire of Vanguard Holdings pierced the clouds. It was no longer a fortress to keep the world out. It was just a building. Her real empire was right here, walking beside her, holding her hand on the way to get ice cream.